Please excuse my voice if it drops in and out. I have a cold, so I'm losing my voice. Today I'll be discussing sex workers in Australia and having a deeper look at why this particular group is largely marginalised by the community and the various disadvantages they face. To begin with, it's important to understand what sex work actually is. Sex work can be broadly defined as the exchange of sexual services, including oral sex, vaginal and anal sex, sexual touching, masturbation, and massage for payment or reward. It's also important to note there is a number of different forms of sex work and the environments in which this type of work takes place. This can include street-based work, brothel work, private work, bondage and discipline services, escort work, tabletop and exotic dancing, and recently we've seen rise to platforms such as OnlyFans, which is web-based sex work. These variations of work forms all create very different experiences of sex work for those involved, and differences in these kind of associated risks and dangers and the standard of living they provide. We also need to have a look at what marginalisation is and the causes behind it to be able to comprehend why a particular group is experiencing marginalisation and disadvantage within a community. Marginalisation can be defined as a state in which individuals are living on the fringes of society due to severely limited access to the resources and opportunities needed to fully participate in society. Marginalised people experience a complex mix of economic, social, and/or health disadvantage, as well as stigma. The AIDS Council of New South Wales estimates there's 20,000 sex industry workers in Australia in any one year, and the average time spent as a sex worker is only averaged out at 2.5 years. Interestingly, New South Wales has the largest population of sex workers, with around 10,000 sex workers in New South Wales alone. Due to legislation and laws, many sex workers refrain from identifying as a sex worker for fear of legal repercussion, and that's why there's limited statistics available. Motivations for entering the sex industry. Economic necessity is considered the main motivation for entering the sex work industry. It's important to understand that workers in the sex industry come from varying backgrounds and life experiences, yet most face the same disadvantages that result in marginalisation from communities. People who enter the sex industry can be anyone, from university students who need some extra money to help get them through their studies, parents who've suffered relationship breakdowns and as a result have increased childcare responsibilities, young people under 18, particularly those who have left home or state care and have found that they've had to financially support themselves, and people seeking to supplement their family's income around holiday time, so Christmases and birthdays. For the purpose of this assessment, the social indicators I'll be discussing that contribute to the disadvantage and marginalisation of sex workers in Australia include access to health resources, geographical location, socioeconomic status, age, level of educational attainment, as well as touching on other contributing outside implications such as personal context, i.e. one's background. And we're also going to have a look at the current legislation in Australia and how that impacts sex workers. So, legislation of sex work in Australia. Each state and territory in Australia has their own laws and legislation regarding sex work. Most familiar is Sex Work Act, which was introduced in 1994. Let's look at some Australian states and territories to compare legislation and help achieve a greater understanding of how it impacts sex workers. In New South Wales, sex work laws are the most progressive and no restrictions apply. However, in South Australia, sex work is still illegal. There have been many attempts to pass a bill to decriminalise it, but so far none have been successful. In Victoria, street sex work is criminalised, whilst in WA, brothels are illegal. In many states, street-based workers, even though legal, are seen as a nuisance or threat to public order, and that brings in stigma from the community and adds to their disadvantage and marginalisation. So what does this mean for sex industry workers? Unfortunately, due to the varying laws surrounding sex work across Australia, many workers are afraid to trust the police should they require help from authorities. This is especially concerning when researching the high levels of sexual assault on sex workers in Australia, many of whom are too afraid to report the crime to police. Previous police experiences and fear of entrapment also significantly contribute to the vulnerability and increased disadvantage. Although there is a level of vulnerability experienced in most sectors of the sex work industry, street-based sex workers are considered to be the most vulnerable due to the nature of their job. Working outside, they're more likely to experience workplace violence, sexual assault, repeat victimization, verbal abuse, physical assault, unlawful imprisonment. Which brings me on to the topic of health and stigma. Statistics show people who work in certain sectors within the sex industry generally have a higher chance of contracting a sexually transmitted infection than those who work in other industries simply because they're having more frequent sex with a higher number of people. Because of this, there's a stigma in many communities that sex workers are dirty or diseased. Ensuring adequate access to health resources and affordable or free sexual health clinics, regardless of one's geographical location or socioeconomic status, is paramount to decreasing disadvantage. After conducting extensive research, it is clear that there are a significant number of disadvantages contributing to the marginalisation of sex workers in Australia. It's clear from the social indicators and the statistics presented that gaps in Australian legislation presents the most predominant social implications and disadvantages within the sex work industry. The varying laws across the different states present a number of gaps and issues that contribute to the safety and the vulnerability of sex workers and their overall trust in authority. The gaps in statistics also presents a problem as we cannot get an accurate representation of the whole population of sex workers in Australia, which again comes back to stigma. Whilst all sex workers experience disadvantage and marginalisation, it is apparent that some sectors are more harshly affected. Health implications such as increased susceptibility to sexually transmitted infections paired with a lack of access to adequate health resources is also a significant problem.